Good evening. I want to remind you that when we conducted our interactive poll asking whether we should continue the discussion about academician Fomenko's hypothesis, 365 people said yes, and only 26 said no. That's why Andrei Podoynitsyn has joined us today. We're going to continue this conversation. But first, perhaps for those who haven't seen our previous broadcasts, I want to say once again that academician Fomenko himself does not come on the air. He considers himself a private, non-public person. But today we have our first interactive question from him. I'll ask Andrei to tell us what Anatoly Fomenko wanted to ask our viewers.
Good evening, Andrei. The question is as follows. Do you believe that in the past, history could have been rewritten to serve political ends?
That's the question. I think you already remember our phone numbers, but just in case, let me remind you. Those who believe this could have happened, call 880-9575-7531. Those who believe that history is never rewritten, call 880-9575-7532. After those three broadcasts, there was quite a bit of criticism. I want to address that right away. We will talk both about this criticism and about the criticism of the criticism. Let me also answer the question of why we don't give the floor to representatives of traditional views on history. I must say that this question seems a bit odd to me, because traditional views on history are given enormous amounts of airtime. Starting with the first Russian printer, Ivan Fyodorov, ever since printing began, it has mostly been used to present traditional historical views. My job as a journalist is not to say, yes, Fomenko is right, or, no, Fomenko is wrong, but to give you the opportunity to become acquainted with Fomenko's theory. After that, you will decide for yourselves whether you agree with it or not. That's my task. Once again, I want to say that to me academician Fomenko is an astonishing phenomenon of human thought. I find it absolutely remarkable that a person could come up with all this. That's why we don't have representatives of traditional views here. We think this is interesting. We're the only ones covering Fomenko's work in such detail. We think it's important. So, here's my first question for you. For those who didn't see the three previous talk shows, briefly, what is the essence of academician Fomenko's hypothesis?
The essence of academician Fomenko's hypothesis is as follows. Based on 25 years of research in the fields of mathematical statistics, probability theory, astronomy, and later a number of other related sciences, academician Fomenko, his closest associate Gleb Nosovsky, and a whole group of researchers came to the conclusion that the history we know as traditional was created in later times, specifically in the 17th and 18th centuries. Real history most likely looked entirely different. In particular, as we put it, there was no such thing as the whole ancient world, from the Sumerians up to the so-called Mongol-Tatar yoke. In reality, these events did take place, but they were duplicated in numerous phantoms that became the framework of what we call ancient history. The real events actually took place in the Middle Ages. To put it very briefly and crudely, that's the essence.
I'd like to ask that we now see the results of our interactive poll. As you can see, for the moment, an overwhelming majority believe that history could have been rewritten. That's exactly what Andrei was just talking about. This is, in a way, a short summary of the three previous episodes. Now let's listen to a question, and then we'll move on to today's discussion. Go ahead, Alexei.
Elena Savelyevna, please, you have the floor.
Hello. I'd like to ask, judging by this theory, as you say, history was rewritten. But from the history that we know of before the birth of Christ, did anything real actually happen?
I'd like to remind our viewers who didn't see our previous broadcast that according to the hypothesis of Anatoly Fomenko, we consider that the birth of Christ took place in the 11th century, around the year 1053 or 1054. Without a doubt, some events did happen before that, and there remain material traces of them. Stone axes, decorations made of animal teeth, and so on. But the thing is, apparently, at that time writing had not yet appeared, and no written sources or records have reached us. Therefore, what remains is not so much speculation, but at least very vague hypotheses as to what might have been. As for events described in chronicles, manuscripts, and documents, it is extremely difficult even to reconstruct what happened in the 11th and especially the 10th century. And so far, we cannot say with certainty what exactly was happening then. According to our reconstruction, again, this is a hypothesis. Most likely, the first and most ancient state ever created on Earth was ancient, or as we call it, Old Rome, which was located on the territory of present-day Egypt.
Ancient Rome was located on the territory of present-day Egypt?
That is the name we use, ancient or Old Rome, meaning the very first Rome. As you know, Moscow was called the Third Rome, and it still bears that name. The capital of this state was in Alexandria. But the information we have about this state and what was happening there is extremely vague. It lies buried under massive layers of later events.
I want to say a huge thank you to all the people who called or sent us messages by email. They are already calling now. Thank you for your interest in this show. When we began, to be honest, we didn't expect such an enormous interest. One question that came up in many of the letters we received was, can you briefly explain how a mathematician, using mathematical research, was able to make discoveries in history? Is it possible to explain that?
In any case, I'll try to do so. I should say right away that this will be only the roughest sketch, without going into detail. What did Anatoly Fomenko actually do?
Excuse me. Let's clarify right away that Anatoly Fomenko is one of the most prominent modern mathematicians, an academician of the Academy of Sciences.
Yes. So, what was done? Imagine that there exists a long, visually unordered signal that appears like white noise. The task is formulated as follows. How do you pick out similar signals, or rather, similar groups of signals, from this white noise? We can use another analogy. For the military, for people engaged in military science, there is the familiar problem of pattern recognition. For example, a satellite takes a photograph of a certain region, and in the picture appear spots, outlines, shapes, and so on. You need to determine which of these spots are submarines and which are icebergs.
And for Fomenko, what was this photograph you mentioned?
This long, seemingly disordered signal, the white noise, was the chronicles, the written sources that describe history and contain historical information. Another parallel could also be drawn. It was like a cipher. In the field of intelligence, the concepts of deciphering and decoding are well known.
And how did he decipher it?
Mathematically. The kinds of problems we're discussing, extracting similar groups of signals from white noise, pattern recognition, deciphering, decoding, these are purely mathematical problems. Mathematicians deal with them professionally throughout their lives. Let me illustrate. In fact, there are 7 methods by which historical documents were analyzed: historical chronicles, manuscripts, works, and so on. One of the methods is called the local maxima method. In brief, it works like this. The problem is formulated as follows. How can one identify chronicles describing the same events? To do this, a chronicle is taken and broken down into chapters. The chapters are then divided by years, and a graph is drawn showing the density of description of individual years in that chronicle. It's obvious that there are years when many events occur. They are described at length, in detail, and so forth. Then the local maxima are identified, the peaks on these graphs. Now, this is not mere speculation, these are experimental results. It was shown experimentally that the spike points of the volume function for interdependent chronicles coincide or are very close. Interdependent chronicles are those that describe the same events. That's what was done. The second principle is the principle of small distortions. It's also called the method of dynastic parallels. Here's how it works. Dynasties are taken, not dynasties in the sense of Carolingians, Capetians, Romanovs, or others. A dynasty here means a sequence of kings, rulers, warlords, or czars spanning 200 to 300 years. A numerical series is compiled that describes the length of rule of each king, warlord, or ruler, and a graph is made. One must keep in mind that chroniclers and historians were human beings. They could make mistakes and introduce inaccuracies. This method makes it possible to take into account the most typical errors of chroniclers. Certain coefficients were derived experimentally, and their values turned out to be very small. These coefficients allow one to analyze chronicles using this method. And I should emphasize, this is not about simply looking for passages in history that resemble each other. That's not the point. Such passages can be found easily enough with much simpler methods. The point is that the entire historical fabric, though many viewers criticized us for using this phrase, turned out to consist of recurring graphs. We said that the whole fabric of history consisted of 4 large blocks, which, when overlaid on one another, turned out to be either identical or very similar. This gave the academician grounds and justification to say that the remaining 3 blocks, which follow the 4th, the latest, are phantom reflections of the most recent block.
By the way, this is exactly what Andrei was just talking about. Frankly, perhaps our viewers, like me, got a bit lost in all these not-so-familiar terms. But that only shows that this system is not speculative. It was developed by a mathematician, a scientist, as I understand it, with the help of computers and a variety of graphs. If you take Anatoly Fomenko's books, you'll see that they contain a huge number of tables and graphs. This is a scientific discovery. You may choose to believe it or not, but it is a scientific discovery, not conjecture. Am I understanding this correctly?
Absolutely. The fundamental basis of Fomenko's hypothesis lies precisely in mathematics, mathematical statistics, probability theory, and partly astronomy. That's the essence.
Let's listen.
I have great trust in academician Fomenko's theory. Some of my own thoughts, however lofty this may sound, are very much in line with what you're saying. But I have a question. If there were no ancient Rome and no ancient Greece, then what are these languages we now know as Latin and ancient Greek? Why is it that, out of the enormous variety of languages, these two are singled out and cultivated as the languages of ancient civilizations?
I should say right away that I personally did not take part in detailed linguistic research. Moreover, in the new chronology group such research has been done, but not as a central focus. Here we rely more on what official philologists and linguists say, broadly speaking. Evidently, in Western Europe, Latin served the same function as Church Slavonic did farther east. Most likely, Latin was codified as the canonical literary language of Western Europe in the 16th–17th centuries, just as Church Slavonic was codified in the East. As for ancient Greek, that story is a little trickier. There are 3 Greek languages: Ancient Greek, Medieval Greek, and Modern Greek. An interesting detail. Medieval Greek and Modern Greek differ greatly from each other, just as Medieval Greek and Ancient Greek do. But Ancient Greek and Modern Greek show a striking similarity.
What does that tell us?
It suggests that Ancient Greek was artificially made older, so to speak, or artificially elevated to the rank of an ancient language, though in fact it is of much later origin.
Among the wave of criticism that naturally came our way, some points were more common than others. Who most often criticized your hypothesis, and for what?
It must be said that criticism of Fomenko's hypothesis arose quite a long time ago. Even in the early 1980s, meetings were held in the history division of the Academy of Sciences, and publications appeared. As for substantive criticism in print, academician Fomenko and his colleagues responded long ago, and with arguments. It's worth mentioning a few specifics. First of all, when it comes to the mathematical research of academician Fomenko, we are not aware of any substantive criticism at all. Simply none. Apparently, that's because in modern historical science, chronology as such is not really studied seriously. If you look at any historical work, a monograph, whatever, you'll see that dates are presented as axioms. You'll read things like, it is considered that, or, it has been proven that. But how it was proven, by whom, and who first said, this is so. Unfortunately, that is never explained. Accordingly, no mathematical or statistical critique of Fomenko's hypothesis exists. As far as we know, it simply doesn't exist. And that is very telling. In fact, some opponents even go so far as to say that applying mathematical methods to history is a mistake altogether. We cannot agree with such a statement. Much more detailed criticism has been directed at the astronomical research. In particular, the works of Yefremov, Pavlovskaya, Zavanyagin, and others are well known. If I may, Andrei, I'd like to comment briefly on Yefremov's work. He is a high-level professional astronomer. He criticized the conclusions drawn in the study of dating the Almagest. But the point is that academician Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky responded to this criticism at the time. Their reply was, first of all, that Yefremov proposed dating by the longitudes of the stars. At first glance this looks very attractive, since the well-known phenomenon of precession of longitudes exists.
I beg your pardon, but right now we're just going to confuse the audience completely. At this point there are already so many words being used whose meaning nobody understands except the experts. I'm afraid we'll get tangled up ourselves. What I really want to understand is this. There was less criticism of the mathematical research, right?
There was no criticism of the mathematics.
More criticism concerned astronomy. What else, and from whom? Who were the people who criticized Fomenko after our broadcast?
Unfortunately, I can't recall their names now.
That's not important, but surely there was some kind of trend.
Yes, there was a trend. What kind of claims did it involve? Either just unsubstantiated ones, saying that Fomenko supposedly made mistakes in his mathematical calculations, mistakes supposedly unworthy even of a first-year student. What does that mean? Naturally, they never pointed out which mistakes exactly. Another line of criticism was that we reject radiocarbon dating, the famous C14 method, allegedly relying on a handful of isolated, outdated, and long-refuted data from the 1960s to 70s, and so on. That's a distortion of the truth. Anyone who has read Fomenko's books would have noticed that we're not talking about isolated facts, but about numerous cases cited not by just anyone, but by archaeologists themselves. For example, the well-known archaeologist Vladimir Miloicic, in his works, subjected radiocarbon analysis to devastating criticism, presenting evidence of outright falsification of laboratory data. Or, for instance, the well-known Russian archaeologist Chernosvitov, who by no means is a supporter of academician Fomenko, nevertheless admits that unfortunately, archaeology does not have an independent and precise dating method. Moreover, the well-known Belarusian archaeologist Zaykovsky presented absolutely striking and very vivid evidence. Here's an example. A burial mound is excavated. Traditional dating methods place it in the era of Kievan Rus. But in this mound, in that very grave, inside the bones, in fact, inside the eye sockets of the skull, coins from the early 19th century are found.
How could that be possible?
It would be good to understand how such a thing could happen from the standpoint of traditional history. But unfortunately, this fact is never explained and in fact, is quietly omitted from excavation reports. Here's another case. A different burial mound is excavated, with the burial located in a mainland pit, meaning in soil layers untouched by plowing, construction, or anything else. It is quite easy to verify geodetically whether the layers were disturbed or not. They were not. Traditionally, this mound is dated to the Bronze Age, that's several thousand years before the Common Era. And yet this doesn't prevent 18th century ceramics from being found in the very same grave.
Let's move on to the next question. Someone's been waiting for quite a while.
Hello, I'd like to ask, what about the Star of Bethlehem, which appeared at the birth of Jesus Christ? Can this be calculated astronomically?
That's the first question, and right away we'll let Nadia ask the second one. Nadia, please.
I'd like to ask, what about world history, which has been recognized by the whole world? And why did people like Fomenko, or like you, only appear now?
It seems our viewers haven't watched our previous broadcasts. So, if you could, briefly, because we've discussed this before. First, about the Star of Bethlehem.
It looks like our opponents have called up reinforcements, so to speak. We talked about the Star of Bethlehem in one of the earlier shows. The point is that this astronomical event is tied to another astronomical event, namely, lunar eclipse in the year of Christ's death. Astronomical reconstruction of these events gives us only one solution on the known historical timeline. That is the 11th century, the explosion of a supernova. In its place today we observe the Crab Nebula. The dating of this event is 1053 to 54 AD. And, accordingly, the eclipse.
So, it just happened later?
Yes, exactly. It all happened, but later. As for the idea that Fomenko, let alone me, only showed up just now, that's not really the case. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, excuse me?
Your theory didn't appear now.
Correct. Anatoly Fomenko had very eminent, even famous predecessors. Isaac Newton, Mikhail Lomonosov, Nikolai Morozov. And, after all, an entire school of hypercriticism in the 19th century, Theodor Mommsen.
So, these are people who claim that history developed in the way Fomenko asserts.
Not exactly. But they did subject traditional chronology to very radical criticism.
Including Lomonosov?
Including Lomonosov, who in his writings described battles of the Russians with the ancient Romans, which, generally speaking, doesn't quite fit into traditional history.
Let's take a look at the results of our first interactive poll. Do you believe? You see the question, and most people do believe. That means that most people are indirectly confirming that Fomenko's theory may have merit. That history may have been distorted, and therefore we must consider it differently. Thank you for your answers. Now Andrei Vladimirovich will ask the second question on his own behalf. Here's the paper, so you don't mix anything up.
The question is this: in your opinion, is the history of the 20th century also being falsified?
This question arises because people often ask, how can that be? After all, there are always living witnesses, and they always remember. This is very important to us. Let's now think and understand, does falsification happen even today, in our own time? Let's recall the history of our Civil War, the Second World War. These events took place not so long ago. Do we always describe them the way they really were? I'd be very interested to hear what you think. In every broadcast, we talk about certain events that are traditionally interpreted one way, while Fomenko interprets them differently. Today I'd like to talk about the Battle of Kulikovo, because, as far as I know, the academician's view is completely different as to when and where it took place.
Indeed, Andrei, this is a very striking example. It's well known that numerous expeditions, probably dozens at different times, were sent to the traditional site of the Kulikovo battle, namely the area between the Don and the Nepriadva rivers, today's Tula province, about 300 kilometers from Moscow. Their findings turned out to be rather meager. There's really no evidence to suggest that the greatest battle of that time took place there.
So, there are no burials?
For example, there are no mass graves of fallen warriors, though there ought to be many.
Excuse me, let's look at the poll results. 17-0 in favor of falsification. Let's see what happens next.
The chronicles claim that Dmitry Donskoy stayed on the battlefield for 8 days, separating Christians from infidels and burying the dead. But there are no mass graves. No large amounts of weapons or anything else, either. And then, in the early 1990s, absolutely astonishing facts came to light. It was discovered that back in the 1930s, during construction work on the territory of what is today the ZIL automobile plant, then the grounds of the Simonov Monastery, when reconstruction was underway, the monastery's grounds were literally found to be standing on bones. A huge area, maybe 100 meters across, turned out to be filled with bones, an enormous mass grave. And you could tell it was a mass grave by the way the skeletons were positioned, mixed together, piled up, even one skeleton upside down. The teeth made it easy to determine that they were young, in plain words, soldiers. Thus, here we have a vast military grave, discovered in 1994, in Moscow, at the modern ZIL site, Simonov Monastery. In 1994, when a small pit was dug for a cellar, so many bones were unearthed that they filled a large wooden box, which was then reportedly reburied somewhere. In the 1930s, the bones were apparently treated with less ceremony. They were simply hauled away.
So, does that mean the Battle of Kulikovo took place on the grounds of today's ZIL plant?
Moreover, archaeologists who came and quickly left, noted that even by their dating, these were 14th century layers. This indicates that a titanic battle took place on the territory of today's ZIL plant. And such a battle would inevitably have been recorded in the chronicles. At that time, only one such battle is known, the Battle of Kulikovo. That's why it seems to us that it would make sense to send substantial archaeological teams and scholars there to investigate everything.
There? To Zilplant?
Exactly, to find out what happened there and what this battle was. And when we recall that the famous heroes of Kulikovo, the warrior monks Perezvet and Oslabya, are buried in Moscow. When we recall that other heroes of the battle are buried at the Andronikov monastery in Moscow, it's fair to ask, were their bodies really transported 300 kilometers from the Don to Moscow for some reason, just to be buried there? Or did the situation look rather different?
Excuse me, a practical question. In the 14th century, was it even possible to transport the dead over such a long distance?
Apparently, in some rare cases it could be done, if we're talking about a czar, a prominent commander, and so on. But here we're talking about thousands or even tens of thousands of people, maybe more. And in general, military traditions, when it comes to mass burials, right up to the present day, dictate that the dead are buried where they fell.
Let's take a call, and then return to the story of the Battle of Kulikovo.
Good evening. Please tell me, doesn't academician Fomenko's theory imply that our civilization is an artificial construct?
By no means. Neither academician Fomenko nor any of us in his group have ever made such conclusions. The only thing we want is for as many people as possible to start thinking about the same problems we're thinking about. We want scholars from related disciplines, other fields of science, to engage with these questions, including, perhaps, the origin of our civilization, and the origin of humanity itself. Because we've been hearing reports, especially from abroad, that there are now different views emerging about the origins of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. But we're not specialists in that area, so we won't make any statements of our own.
Now, regarding the Battle of Kulikovo, I'd like to understand the situation. So, there's this large burial site. Russian people don't need to travel anywhere, it's right in Moscow. You said it was discovered in the 1930s, and now it's the end of the century. And after that, it's as if it just doesn't exist?
That's what it looks like.
In the history books, in the traditional literature, is this burial site ignored completely? Or is it explained somehow?
If anyone has explained it, it doesn't seem to have been in the wider scholarly press, because we, for one, are not aware of such publications. As far as I know, back in the 1930s, archaeologists labeled this burial site unpromising. What exactly that lack of promise was supposed to mean, I can't say. But the fact remains. There are other facts, too. For example, take old icons. As we know, they were coated with linseed oil varnish, and as is equally well known, over the years, about a century, it would darken. So, the icon would be repainted. Today, there are chemical methods to remove later layers, and this process is called opening an icon. Everyone knows about opened icons. And it must be said, this is a real treasure trove for our knowledge. Because many old icons have survived unopened, they can now be restored. When old icons depicting the Battle of Kulikovo are opened, a very curious thing emerges. The same thing we see in ancient miniatures. If you look at both armies, the soldiers on each side are shown as completely identical. Same faces, ordinary European faces, same beards, same weapons, same clothing, same armor, absolutely identical. But the most interesting thing is that they even carry the same standards and holy banners. In particular, the well-known ancient Russian battle standard, the holy face of Jesus on a black field.
And what does that tell us?
It tells us that on both sides it was Russians fighting Russians. There were no so-called Mongols, no people from Asia at all.
So, who was fighting whom?
According to our reconstruction, according to Anatoly Fomenko's reconstruction, the largest civil battle took place between the army of Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy and the Temnik or Commander Mamai. His other name, which we are now gradually managing to recover, was apparently the Tizyatsky Ivan Velyaminov. A few words should be said about the order that existed at that time in ancient Russia. Supreme power was embodied by two figures, the Grand Prince, who was also the Khan, and the Tizyatsky, a kind of analogue of a minister of defense. The authority of these two men was almost equal. Both positions were hereditary. Dmitry Donskoy, a very talented and warlike prince, took advantage of the death of the old Tyziatsky and decided to abolish the post, making himself the sole ruler. Naturally, this provoked a reaction from the son of the previous Tyziatsky, Ivan Velyaminov. And so, a colossal battle took place, in which participants on both sides were, broadly speaking, Russians. That is, Russians, Turkic peoples, and so forth.
Now, I'd like to take a look at the question of falsifications in the 20th century. Clearly, the answer, yes, is at 67, no, at 4. So, we are convinced that falsification of our history can happen today, but for some reason we don't believe it could have happened in the 14th, 15th centuries and beyond. Strange. Let's see if that changes.
Strictly speaking, in the 20th century falsifying history is much harder because of the globalization of the information sphere, universal literacy, and now also the internet, and so on.
Let's take a question, please.
I have a question for the host. I've listened closely to all your broadcasts. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Don't you think that true history, at least scrolls and manuscript copies, is kept in Tibetan monasteries, which in 23, I believe, received expeditions from both Hitler and the communists?
That's a question for you, since I'm not a specialist in this.
You know, scrolls, books, manuscripts are kept all over the place. The Vatican Library has the richest collections, as do monasteries in Tibet, Russian monasteries, European churches, and so on. We don't deny any of this. These are well-known facts. What matters is when they were written, by whom, and on the basis of which primary sources.
This is an important point, because, I think I've mentioned this before, we once had a call from a boy who visited Novgorod. He said there are birch bark manuscripts there labeled with such and such a century. He asked, was that just made up out of thin air? There are also all sorts of deeds of sale.
You see, we fully agree that on the basis of so-called independent, non-historical ancient documents, above all, economic records, it is generally speaking, theoretically possible to reconstruct chronology. Another question is whether this has ever been done by anyone, at any time, or not. For now, it is implicitly assumed that if such work were carried out, it would confirm the old, traditional Scaligerian history. But that is far from the case. This still has to be demonstrated. As for the birch bark manuscripts, we, for our part, would be very curious to hear the opinion of official science on why, out of 967 known birch bark manuscripts, about 900 were found specifically in Novgorod.
Do you think they're forgeries? We've already talked about this.
Either that very rigid point of view, or at the very least, it suggests that Novgorod, at the time when those birch bark manuscripts were being made, was not at all the wealthiest region of Russia, but rather the opposite. People wrote on birch bark not out of great wealth, but rather out of great poverty.
Another question, which I found extremely interesting and which I received via the internet. Why is it that, say, in tiny Belgium or in Holland, or in France, there are several languages and dialects? But in the vast country of Russia, from Brest to Kamchatka, people speak essentially one language, Russian? You said you are not a linguistics specialist, but surely you have some point of view on this?
Personally, I do have a point of view, which I would call half question, half assertion. You quite rightly noted that the Russian language is a great exception in this respect. The fact is, it's not only in Little Belgium that people speak two completely different languages. We see the same thing in Germany. I myself speak German, and I can state with complete confidence that if Bavarians, or Northerners speaking Plattdutch, or Saxons were talking next to me, I would have great difficulty understanding what they were saying to each other. The same picture exists in France, in Italy, in Great Britain, and so on. And yet all of Russia speaks one language. I would also like to note that the Russian language has not only this peculiarity. Linguists, not us, affirm that, in its capacity to reflect the full diversity of the surrounding world, Russian is one of the richest and most developed languages. At the same time, Russian is also the most stable. Again, I emphasize, linguists claim that the Russian language in this respect does not just stand out somehow, but is in fact an exception within the Indo-European family. It turns out that Mikhail Lomonosov wrote about this subject as well. He studied the question of how Russian is the most stable in terms of its core rules, vocabulary, and pronunciation. A people's language, in our view, is proof of the highest order. It cannot be falsified, it cannot be forged. It is, so to speak, a given, a reality. It seems to us that if the Russian language displays precisely these qualities, then most likely it was on this territory, earlier than anywhere else, that there existed a unified state, a unified religion, a unified material economy, a unified market, and most likely excellent and actively functioning means of communication, in other words, roads. Furthermore, it appears that the Russian language is closer than any other to the original source language that linguists speak of, the Proto-Indo-European language.
So, does that mean the Russian Empire is almost the most ancient?
If we judge by languages, if we strictly follow logic and what we see in the realm of languages, then yes. Let's put it this way. Russians speak the language that is closest to the original source.
Let's sum up our interactive poll. 80 people called in, 79 of them, I honestly can't remember a case like this, voted for the same point of view. The only other time was when we asked whether we should continue the broadcast.
Apparently, because it's so obvious that these falsifications really did and still do take place. Let's look at how the Yugoslav War is described today by the Americans, the Chinese, for example, and by us, and by the Estonians. We find astonishing things. If we didn't know beforehand that it was the same war, we probably wouldn't even guess.
So, one can assume that even after a shorter time, if people rely on our sources, they may have completely different views of the Yugoslav War.
Andrei, just over 50 years ago the Second World War ended. Let's look at the existing monographs and see what is written about it. We'll find an astonishing variety of perspectives.
We have 2.5 minutes left. There's one more extremely important question that people often ask. You've already been asked whether there are people in the world who share Fomenko's views. You mentioned a West German scholar, just one. But what about other countries? In America? In France?
I was speaking of a community of scholars. There are about 30 of them, Germans.
I mean in one country. But in France, in England, in the United States, are there, roughly speaking, followers of Fomenko? That is, people who think the same way, who see the same errors.
I know for certain that right now, in the US, Fomenko's mathematical calculations are being checked. And again, this is being done by professional mathematicians, by professional physicists, people who can form a fully professional judgment about the quality of this work. I think that within the next few months, perhaps half a year, we'll learn what conclusions have been reached in Silicon Valley, in Colorado, in Cambridge, and so on.
That is to say, there already are some scholars overseas who are working on the same things.
Who are familiar with Fomenko's point of view.
So, Fomenko is not a lone figure, that's what I want to say.
By no means.
Well then, all that remains is for me to thank you. This is your host, Andrei Maksimov,